Chippewa Lake Park ran for almost exactly 100 years, and for most of that century, it looked untouchable. Tens of thousands of people packed its beaches and ballroom every summer. Today, the rides are still standing. The forest just grew straight through them, and the real reason a 100-year-old amusement park vanished has almost nothing to do with what people usually assume. To understand how that happens, you have to go back to a lake in rural Medina County, Ohio, long before there were any rides on it at all. Chippewa Lake is the largest natural inland lake in Ohio, carved out by retreating glaciers thousands of years ago. By the mid-1800s, people were already showing up on their own to picnic and swim. Somebody just needed to build something to keep them there. That somebody, in the most repeated version of the story, was a man named Edward Andrews from nearby Seville, who bought up shoreline land around 1870 to 1875 and opened a resort with a hotel, a restaurant, a dance hall, and a picnic grove, calling it Andrews Pleasure Grounds. A competing local account credits a businessman named Oscar Townsend and a railroad company with developing the resort in the 1880s and giving it the name it would keep. The two stories may not even conflict. One could be the picnic ground starting, the other the railroad turning it into something bigger. Either way, by around 1878, the name had changed to Chippewa Lake Park, and so had the ambition. What made the location work wasn't just the lake, it was the tracks. A rail line, and later an interurban line, ran straight from Cleveland to the lake. Families didn't need a car, they needed a ticket. The first attractions were simple: a horse-drawn carousel called the Flying Dutchman, and a single-drop coaster whose cars had to be pushed back up the hill by hand. Primitive, also enough to get people talking. Here's the detail that quietly set up everything that came later. This park didn't grow as one unified company. It grew the way a lot of old amusement parks did, with individual operators owning their own rides and stands and just paying to set up on the property. That model is great for getting a park running fast. It's a nightmare when the whole place eventually needs an expensive, coordinated modernization. Nobody was thinking about that in the 1870s. By 1898, a new owner arrived who would define the park for the next 70 years. Mac Beach took over and banned liquor sales, cleaning up the resort's rowdy reputation and turning it into a real family destination. His son Parker Beach later ran it through what almost everyone agrees was the golden age. By the 1920s, Chippewa Lake Park was pulling crowds from Cleveland, Akron, Canton, and Worcester. Medina County schools reportedly closed for a day each spring for Nickel Day, when kids could ride everything for a nickel. Companies from the industrial cities nearby held their annual picnics there. The centerpiece was the Starlight Ballroom, built around 1920, a massive indoor-outdoor dance hall built specifically for touring big bands. And it delivered. Lawrence Welk played there. So did Benny Goodman. The Dorsey brothers came through with a young singer named Frank Sinatra. Glenn Miller's band performed on that floor. This wasn't a small-town venue booking local acts. This was a real stop on the national circuit. Then came the ride people still talk about. In 1924 and 1925, the park built a wooden coaster called the Big Dipper. Worth clearing up here because it gets repeated wrong constantly. That coaster was not designed by the famous architect John Miller. That's a mix-up with a different Big Dipper built the same year at Geauga Lake, which actually was a Miller design. Chippewa's coaster was built by a father and son team, Fred and Josiah Pierce. Smaller than its Geauga Lake cousin, around 50 feet tall, with a tunnel and plywood crash doors riders burst through in the dark. It didn't need to be the biggest coaster in Ohio. For the people who rode it, it was simply the one from their childhood. Around it grew a kiddie coaster, a wild mouse, a mechanical carousel, a Ferris wheel, and a rare spinning ride called the Tumble Bug that only a handful of American parks ever had. Down by the water, a launch called the Miss Chippewa carried passengers around the lake, while speedboats named Dynamite and Firecracker gave thrill seekers something faster. The Historical Society estimates crowds sometimes reached into the tens of thousands on a good day, though no official turnstile counts survive, so treat that as local legend more than hard data. Here's the thing though, a place can be beloved and still be structurally fragile at the same time. And Chippewa Lake Park was. It was rural. It was seasonal. Ohio summers are short, and a business that only really makes money for a few months a year has very little room for error. Its footprint was small, under 100 acres, while its biggest competitors were expanding aggressively. Those competitors had names that still mean something today. Cedar Point, an hour away on Lake Erie, and Geauga Lake, closer to Cleveland. Both were modernizing with steel coasters and marketing budgets Chippewa Lake didn't have. One Historical Society member later put it bluntly, "The rides here were well cared for, but still less attractive than the new kind that were up at Geauga Lake and Cedar Point." That's not a small problem. That's the beginning of the end, quietly ticking along underneath decades of good summers. By the late 1960s, the ticking got louder. In 1969, the Beach family sold the park to a Cleveland company called Continental Business Enterprises. On paper, this looked like exactly what an aging park needed, a corporate buyer with capital to modernize. In practice, investment stayed thin, and the park leaned more on booking rock concerts than rebuilding infrastructure. The last genuinely profitable year is generally placed in the early 1970s. After that, the numbers slid and didn't come back. Here's where the story gets stranger than a simple decline. The new owners reportedly did draw up modernization plans. But there was a catch. Local officials wanted the company to help fund infrastructure upgrades to handle the tourism those plans would bring. The company considered that unworkable. Both sides dug in, each assuming the other would cave. Neither did. At the end of the 1978 season, the park's 100th year. If you count from that 1878 renaming, the company quietly decided not to reopen. There was no farewell tour, no big announcement. One small Oktoberfest in the fall of 1979 turned out to be the last public event. That February, the Akron Beacon-Journal reported the owners had confirmed they wouldn't open and planned to sell. 100 years of nickel days and big bands, and the ending barely made a headline. Because everyone still expected the closure to be temporary, nobody properly shut the place down. Beds stayed made in the hotel, tables stayed set in the ballroom, coin-filled arcade machines sat untouched. It was less like a business closing and more like everyone stepping out for a long lunch that never ended. That single decision is why Chippewa Lake Park would later become one of the most photographed, abandoned amusement parks in America. Nature and neglect did the rest in stages, and each stage made the last one worse. A maintenance shed burned in 1980. In 1982, fire took out the Penny Arcade, packed with vintage machines. Locals have said that fire was the real moment the community understood the park wasn't coming back. The picnic pavilion burned in 1988. In 1991, vandals reportedly kicked off the property earlier that day, came back, and torched the old hotel in retaliation. And in 2002, after roughly 80 years standing, the Starlight Ballroom burned to the ground. Reports differ on why. Some say a miner accidentally started it, others call it arson. Either way, the building that defined the Golden Age was gone. Meanwhile, the forest didn't wait for permission. Trees grew straight up through the Big Dipper's track and through the spokes of the Ferris wheel until it looked less like a ride and more like something the woods had swallowed. That image became the park's unofficial symbol, turning up in a 2007 documentary called Welcome Back Riders. and a 2010 horror film shot on site 2 years earlier. For a while, the only visitors left were the ones sneaking past no trespassing signs. Then in 2008, it looked like the story might turn around. A group called Chippewa Partners bought the property for roughly $3.5 million and announced a redevelopment called Chippewa Landing, a hotel and spa, restaurants, a conference and music center targeted for 2010. That sounds like a rescue. It wasn't. Crews cleared trees, the public was invited to farewell tours, and in June of 2010, the Big Dipper came down in about a week. The plan wasn't to preserve what people loved. It was to clear the ground for something new. That something new never got built. By 2012, the plans had collapsed into a lawsuit and foreclosure. A sheriff's sale that summer had to be redone over a technicality. An August auction failed to find a buyer. In 2013, the Wild Mouse was torn down. Another group floated an entertainment venue plan that fall. Nothing came of it. The land sat back on the market in 2015 and again in 2017, listed around $3.5 million with no takers. In December 2017, even the old excursion boat was hauled off to Tennessee for restoration, one more piece of the park quietly leaving for good. For over a decade, the site just sat there, not developed, not preserved, not sold. A 100-year-old amusement park reduced to a fenced patch of forest with a Ferris wheel skeleton in the middle, waiting for someone to decide what it was even for anymore. The answer, when it came, wasn't a revival, and it wasn't condos. It was the county. In June 2020, the Medina County Park District bought the roughly 95-acre property for $2.1 million, reportedly below its appraised value, after quietly pursuing the land for nearly 20 years. This was a public agency looking to give the land back to the community in a different form. Working with planners and public input, the district built a master plan that treats the old park less like a business to revive and more like a landscape to reclaim. Trails, an observation tower, boat rentals, a lake house and museum, and efforts to physically preserve what is left of the Ferris wheel, the Little Dipper, and the Tumble Bug rather than demolish them. The first piece of that plan opened in May 2026, a trailhead named after the old Tumblebug ride, with a picnic shelter and a half-mile loop trail leading toward where the ride once stood. About 70 people showed up for the ribbon cutting. The park district's director summed it up simply. This was the first step toward making Chippewa Lake Park a destination. Again, just a very different kind of destination this time, with no tickets and no gates. A local historical society, formed in 2015, now leases a century-old house on the property and opened a small museum in 2025, collecting donated pieces of the past, an old roller coaster car, a restored Tumblebug car, even one of the original ticket booths, salvaged before the old entrance was cleared in late 2024. What's left on the ground today is a strange mix of ruin and quiet renewal. The Ferris wheel frame still stands, half wrapped in trees. Sections of the old train track and the Tumblebug's rail are still there. The stone chimney from the old hotel still marks where the building used to be. Most of it remains off-limits while the rest of the plan slowly gets built out. For decades, this was a place people weren't supposed to go near, known mostly through photographs taken by people who technically weren't allowed to be there. Now, for the first time since 1978, part of it is legally open again, not as an amusement park, but as a walking trail past the bones of one. The lake is still there. The Ferris wheel is still there, tangled in trees older now than most of the people who used to ride it. The crowds never really left the property. They just come back these days without buying a ticket.